Welcome to my narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Snowy Redwood. This painting was accomplished on a half sheet of 140 pound cold press Lanaquero watercolor paper, size 15 inches by 20 inches. On the right is the photo I used for reference for my painting Snowy Redwood. When I do a painting like this, it's not about trying to copy the photograph. It's all about trying to create my interpretation of the subject that I'm looking at. This is a photo of the sketch I did on my painting surface. It's a very basic sketch with just an outline of the major shapes. If you want a copy of this or copy the reference photo, I've placed a link for both of those on my website video page. So if you go to rsurowiczart.com and go to the videos tab, you can find the links to download both the drawing and the reference photo. I'm going to go through the color combinations that I used to do this painting, and I used three main mixtures. The first one is a combination of quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral. I like these two when mixed together. They make a nice gold orange. They're a very rich tone. It's kind of like a burnt sienna, but much richer than the burnt sienna out of the tube. Unfortunately, my quinacridone gold is Daniel Smith, and the formulation is no longer available, but they do have a replacement out there, as do others have quinacridone gold, and you should get similar results. The next mixture I'm going to use is kind of a classic mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. These two, when mixed together, can give you a very nice neutral, and they're frequently used in landscapes. And when you mix these two here, this is kind of a light mixture, so it's going to give me a kind of a depending on which way I swing this, it can give me a cool or a warm neutral. So there, a little bit more blue gives me a cool one. And you can take these with a little more pigment in them and mix them together, and you can get a fairly dark value. So same mixture, just more pigment. I get a little bit more blue in there, and you can see it starts to give you a fairly dark tone. Now, along with these two colors, I'm also going to use a little bit of raw sienna, which is a warm color, not too far really from yellow ochre. And you could use yellow ochre here for what I'm doing, but I use this a little bit to bring a warm tone to some of the tree limbs and some of the branches that throughout the composition. The last mixture I'm going to use here is what I'm going to use for primarily for the snow, and I am putting down cerulean blue, and again I'm using ultramarine blue, and then the third color that I'm going to use here is rose madder quinacridone. So I'll mix these colors together to give me a couple different purplish tones, and I'll use the blues as they are, especially the cerulean, to give me kind of a blue light feeling bouncing around the snow. I'll make this mixture fairly light at times. I won't go real dark in value with it. Not really anything beyond a middle value, but mostly middle to light light. So before I paint, I'm going to do quite a bit of masking in this painting. I'm using a squeeze bottle here that I filled myself. There's two varieties that I use. This one doesn't have as fine a tip, and it delivers a nice bead that I can also spread around if I want. And it's not as fine as the fine line masking pen, but it's not bad, and rarely have any trouble with this one clogging. It's got a very uncomplicated lid on it, and it just normally comes right out. So what I'm going to highlight here with some of this masking is some of these areas where there's going to be snow resting on the tree. I'm going to preserve that white so that I can have the pure white of the paper towards the end of my painting process. Now I'm going to take that same bottle and I'm going to put some masking fluid along some of these limbs that are reaching out. And some of these are going to be darker than the background they're on. I could paint over, but I like to keep some light areas in them too. And I'm going to come here with a wash, kind of a purplish blue wash for the snow. And I really don't want that color on the limbs of the tree. I want to have this kind of orangey brown and some splashes of white around there. So I'm going to protect them so that when I do go to put some of the washes on for the snow, I can just take that purple or blue tone and just make one nice brush stroke that goes over top of many different shapes, and I don't have to worry about painting in between them. And I could, but just doing it this way for me lets me to be more expressive with my brush strokes. I can just make one big brush stroke, and I don't have to worry about the blues or purple tones getting in there where I don't want. Now I'm going to start doing some work with the masking in the background. Here there's a shrub that's coming out of the snow, has some of the branches coming out of the snow, and I'm making marks that will later kind of indicate the highlights on these branches that I'll be making marks with my paintbrush. And then I'm going to start to take this bottle, and I'll take a finer bottle too, and you can see, you look at this picture to the left, that top part of this picture, the wood's pretty thick. It has a lot of thicket. Yeah, I have no intention of trying to render that. So my challenge in solving that is, how do I represent that? What is my interpretation going to be? And I look at it more as a texture that I'm going to recreate, and almost a pattern. So I'll take these bottles with masking fluid, and I'll make marks to suggest branches, twigs, and they're kind of arbitrary marks, but they're while they're arbitrary, I'm still trying to maintain some direction. So this bottle here has a finer tip, and it's going to give a finer line. You can see I'm just carrying those marks around in different directions. Some are long, some are short, and later on, as I start to paint over top these and build up other textures with darker value with paint, it will start to create a layer. And then as I take this off later on, these highlights will start to show, and then I'll come over top of those with some more paint, and as I start to build this layer upon layer effect, which gives the suggestion of this texture that I'm after, and that's my interpretation of what's going on there in the woods. So I've used those bottles of masking fluid to create a lot of linear shapes. Now I'm going to take an old toothbrush with a jar of masking fluid, and I'm just going to splatter that over top my surface. And normally I'll just flick it with my finger to get a finer spray, and then I'll tap it on my hand, and I'll get some larger drops, and that helps clear the brush. And one note is, normally before I start working with a brush and masking fluid, I'll put a little soapy water in it so it gives me a better chance of cleaning it up later. Another thing I'll mention here is, if you notice, I have some brown paper underneath my drawing board. If you're going to do this and give it a try, make sure you do put some paper or something around, or you will splatter your masking fluid on whatever's nearby, and it can be not a lot of fun to clean up sometimes. Should you get a few drops in places that you don't want, don't panic, just let it dry, and once it's dry you can just peel it up. So I'm done applying the masking fluid. I've let it thoroughly dry, and there's going to be a lot of texture back there on the work surface. So I'm going to begin working with the snow first. And as I mentioned, when I put that masking down, one of the reasons was so I could just do some expressive brush strokes without having to worry about going in between branches and other things. So you can see here, I'm just making nice swinging motions with my arm as I put some of these strokes down. And I don't have to worry about getting over top of every little branch. Sometimes I might have painted the tree or masked the tree, but I decided not to. I don't think I really had to in this one. But I've got this mixture here now of ultramarine blue with a little rose madder or quinacridone. And one of the things I got to be careful here is everything's getting too parallel. I'm going to soften these edges up a little bit, but those are kind of two identical lines going in the same direction, exactly parallel to each other. There's no curve in them, and I don't want it to look like a racetrack going across there. So I have to be aware of that, and I'll probably try and tone that down a little bit as I go. I'm going to take a little bit of a blue tone and put into that purple there. It's a little bit more, a little heavier on the ultramarine blue. And here I'm trying to put a little bit more curve in that shadow, because the land isn't just flat, although it's pretty flat where these shadows are going across. There, you want the shadows to follow the contour of the land. So try to keep that in mind as you're painting these. That's why, so you don't end up, like I said, with a bunch of racing stripes going across your page. And in this situation, it could look like that because these are very long shadows, and you don't want them to all look the same. So I have to be careful of that. So here I'm trying to put a couple marks, and I soften them with a spray, very fine mist spray, just to give the indication of some little dips and irregularities in the surface and the snow. So I just kind of hit my brush in a few spots, a little splatter, and then I'll take the fine mist spray bottle I like to use and just hit it with that and soften those edges up a little bit and let it run around. This is where I'm saying it's about your artistic interpretation of what's going on there. I'm not making, I know there's, in my photograph, there's these little marks in the snow, but I'm not trying to get each one. If there's 15 of them, I'm not trying to paint 15 little divots in the snow. I'm just trying to give the suggestion that there's some little pockets and little irregularities in the land, and I don't have to try and render each one to do that. So now here in the background, you can see I'm trying to make sure that the spacing is varied in these shadows going across, so they're not all the same. At the same time, I'm trying to make sure that I vary the width in some places. I also want to have some interruption, and I don't want them all to go from edge to edge, so it looks like I've laid down a sheet of notebook paper. I want to break those up and try and make them look different than one another. So now I'm going to take a mixture of ultramarine blue and rose madder quinacridone, and I'm going to start applying a light purple tone to several areas across my composition. Here I've got a little bit on the right side of that tree, and I'm just trying to soften that edge a little bit. And I'm going to take some of that same tone, I'm going to go over to the left side of my composition and start to take some of those areas down, tone some of that white area down, and so you can start to see a little bit more distance and foreground being suggested. So I have a little bit deeper purple value tone here, and I'm working a little bit in the background to start to create a bit of a horizon line back there. Here I've worked across the page a bit, and I'm going to start making some marks that give the indication of some of the shadows being cast by the branches from the trees. Here I'm going to get a little bit bold, and I'm going to use my mixture of quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral. And it gives this nice rich kind of a burnt sienna tone, but much nicer than what you would get out of the tube in terms of burnt sienna. And I'm taking a 1-inch wash brush here and making some marks down the edge of the side of this tree. And then I'm going to come back in here with my mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and use those in various ratios to get some neutrals, some cool neutrals and some warmer neutrals. And here I've got a brush, again it's a 1-inch brush, it's not my wash brush, but it's a nice 1-inch flat, and I've got a darker value here leaning more towards the warm, towards the burnt sienna side in this mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And now I've got a a mixture that's a little bit more leaning towards the cool side, I put a little bit more blue in there. So the nice thing is this neutral right there with that leaning towards the ultramarine blue being the complement of burnt sienna, it really helps that orange tone, that mixture of quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral, really helps it glow a little bit, because you're playing a neutral and a neutral that has a little bit of a tinting of a complement in it right against that bright tone. So it really helps make it glow some. I'm going to show you another example of me using this tone. Here's a painting that I've done recently. It's a painting I call Timber Flow. It's got water rushing down through some rocks and timber, and you can see this same kind of a orange tone. It's the same mixture. You can see how it glows against those neutrals. And to make this really glow and work in both these paintings, you need not only that nice rich tone, but you also need the neutrals to position them against it. That helps make them stand out and give them that nice rich tone and glow. Now I have my brush loaded with a dark value mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I'm starting to develop that shrub that's sticking out of the ground there, putting some darker values down. And here you can see just some touches with the brush on the end and some on the corner, and trying to give me a variety of brush marks. And keep in mind, as I'm putting these brush marks, some of these are going to be broken up a little bit more once the masking fluid is removed. Because remember, that's the area where I splattered some of that masking fluid. So I'm using this 1-inch brush, and I'm just starting to create patterns of tree trunks. Again, this is another area where I'll talk about artistic interpretation. I'm not counting the trees that are in the photograph that I have. I know there's a bunch of them there, so I'm just going to make a bunch with my brush. I'm not worried about trying to paint the exact trees. This is, again, more of an artistic interpretation of the scene that I'm working with. So there's a lot of this linear trunk activity in the background. And the one thing I'll mention is, when you're doing things like this, or painting trees or something similar, you don't want them all to look the same. So try and vary the width. Try and start some at different areas, where they're in the ground. Break them up a little bit. Don't make the line solid. Just make a mark and then skip a little bit, then make another mark that you know that it's still the same tree, but it's interrupted. And here I've got a little bit of this orangey mixture on my brush. I'm just giving some touches of color back there, because I'm trying to develop this as a whole painting, not just pieces, parts. So little by little I try and work the colors around, the values around, and just start to build these layers of value, color, overlap. Now I'm going to take a 1.5-inch wash brush, and it's loaded with a darker value, and I'm just going to start making lots and lots of marks back here to try and create that texture that I had talked about, and a pattern that makes you believe that you're looking at woods there in the background. I think that's part of the problem we're trying to solve, is you're trying to make the viewer believe that they're looking at a bunch of trees and not just a lot of brush marks. And you can do that, I feel, without having to take little brushes and render them for hour upon hour. So you start to build your layers, start to build your values, and little by little it just starts to come into focus, and you can start to see it. So I continue to use this 1.5-inch flat brush and load it up with a neutral, and I've been making linear marks, vertically slanted and sideways, But now I'm actually starting to push my brush harder and actually smash it into the surface a little bit, and it's almost creating like a glaze effect. And that's starting to make that area into more one shape, and things start to feel a little distant and less defined. And this is where I'm talking about trying to get the most out of your brush. You can use one brush to make many different kinds of marks normally, especially the larger ones. And here is a good example of that. And little by little, I've been building these layers, and now I start to see this kind of a feel of a distant wooded area. At this point, my brush is a little dry, still has pigment in it, and I'm starting to make marks that are created just by dragging the brush, and it's making multiple linear shapes at one time in very irregular patterns, just given the suggestion of twigs, and they're spaced farther apart than what I had in the background, so I've changed the pattern a little bit and the texture, and it's now starting to look more twiggy like than just a bunch of distant brush. I've got a darker value here, and I want to try and build up more of the suggestion of a horizon there. You always want to have some definition of a horizontal plane in a landscape, so I'm going to try and do that just by putting a dark value here to suggest more of a horizon line. Here I've taken that darker value and taken it off the edge a little bit. I'm going to take just a little bit more. Now I'm starting to work a little bit around my painting, and here I'm putting in some darker tree trunk shapes. So this is, again, trying to build another layer over top of what I already have, and I'm using a darker value. You can see how, too, I break those lines up to let them go behind other already existing branches that I have there. So I've been making those dark valued tree shapes there in the distance, and now I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to make the similar mark, but instead of stopping where I've been stopping, I'm going to drop that tree down just a little bit lower, and that brings it closer to us. It gives the indication that it's somewhere between this tree in the foreground and those in the distance. I want to start making some marks to indicate some of these twigs and some of these branches breaking off, coming off the main heavier branches. And to do that, I've got a 1/2 inch flat brush loaded with a dark value. And I'm going to make a few marks with this. However, at some point, I'm also going to go back to a small rigger brush, because the flat brush makes some nice marks, but the one limitation they can have is when you want to have some nice sharp curves. There's a turning radius associated with that brush, depending on how wide it is, and you can't necessarily make some of the free-flowing linear marks that you'd like to make, because they start to get kind of angular as you turn. There's a tree shape back here that I've masked, and I want to do some painting on it, but I still want to leave the mask where there's branches crossing over it. So I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to make a cut in the masking, and I'm going to remove the masking in the area that I want to paint, and that will leave me protecting the branch shape that's crossing over it. So I just made a cut so that I could peel it off and then it would break away at the right spot. So there's the bottom of the tree shape. And now I've got the same situation right above it. So I'm making a mark there, or a cut, and then I'm going to pull that masking up. I'm going to take a little bit of that brighter orange tone, and I'm going to start putting it in on the edge of this tree shape I have back here. That helps carry that glow towards the back there and repeats it on this other tree that's a little farther back. Now I'm going to take a darker value. I'm going to bring it down that trunk. As I get this tree finished, maybe you can see now that by putting that tone and that dark value on that tree there, it starts to build a relationship with this tree in the foreground. And now the viewer's eye is starting to be pulled back in space from this front tree. You're starting to be drawn back now to that tree that's farther back with that same tone. And then you kind of turn a corner a little bit and go straight back to that other tree that was dropped down lower than the others. And it starts to draw you back into space into this painting. I'm going to put a darker value in some of these areas here where I have the snow. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is it is right beside an area where I've masked to indicate snow sitting on the branch. So I want a darker value right beside that so that when I remove that masking fluid, that suggestion of snow on the tree will stand out more. If I left it kind of very light valued and watered down, it really wouldn't have the impact that it does when it's next to a darker value. I'm taking a little bit of that darker valued purple tone and I'm putting some up here in the foreground, trying to balance that out a little bit. And again, this relationship with those other dark purples helps move the eye back in space through the composition. I'm at a point where I'm ready to remove the masking fluid that I applied at the beginning of my process. And if I were trying to create the atmosphere of falling snow, I would have done this at the very end. There's times when I'll use that splatter, and at the very end I'll lift off the masking fluid, and it gives that nice suggestion of snow falling with a pure white splattering effect. But in this painting, I'm not trying to do that. So all that splatter and all this texture I have in the background, I still have quite a bit of painting to do over top of, because I'm not looking to maintain that as the pure white of the paper. A lot of this area that I saved are some of the longer and larger branches, and then the suggestion of all the branches that are scattered amongst all these trees. So these are areas that I'll be bringing in some of that burnt sienna and ultramarine, as well as I'll bring in some of this raw sienna tone on these branches. And so a lot of this white's going to disappear, but certain areas are going to stay as pure white to suggest the snow. So I'll be using the similar mixtures that I used on the tree and in the background on these limbs that are sticking out. However, they're just a little bit lighter than some of the trunk areas, and this is where I'm using a little bit of this raw sienna, which is a much lighter warm color. Here again, some of this warmer tone over top of these branch shapes, and now it's starting to really fill out and start to describe what's really the wood of the tree and what's snow. At this point, I'm going to start to tone down some of this background area with some color. So I'm taking some of that that warm orange sienna tone, and I'm taking that back there, and then I'm going to take some cooler, more neutral colors too, and take some of that area back. But if I was keeping this to a scene where I thought I was trying to suggest snow was falling, I wouldn't be covering all the area that I had masked. But it serves a purpose, because you can see now, even though it's not the pure white of the paper, it's a light, warm, neutral tone that you can see the shapes of over top of the dark washes that had been put in before I removed the mask. So on the right side, you can see how toned down that is next to the left area there. And now I'm starting to bring a cooler wash there into that area and some warm tones. And I'm taking down the brightness of that area by putting a glaze over top of it. And it starts to feel a little bit more like it's a distant wooded area. I'm taking a very dark value here, which is a strong mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I'm just strengthening the shadows on this tree a little bit and making them a little bit more defined, be a little more precise with my brush strokes, which I haven't been super precise to this point, but it just deepens the shadow on that side of the tree. So I'm continuing to put some more of that dark tone on the shadow side of that tree. And I'm going to take some of that and put it down near the lower area there where the snow is. And putting that very dark value right beside the snow helps make it stand out a little bit more. So these limbs are a little nondescript, and I'm going to take some darker values and try and make them a bit more interesting. And I'm trying to contour the shape of the branch, so I'm making some brush marks and trying to give the suggestion that the dark values I'm putting on there are kind of wrapping around the diameter of that branch. But it needs something to make it a little bit more interesting, and not just an even just a simple even tone going the whole length of the branch. And doing the same thing here with this branch, putting some darker values on it that contour the diameter, the shape of that branch, and just make it a little bit more interesting. And now here's where I'm going to take this liner brush and make some more of these marks and give the suggestion of smaller branches going over top of and behind some of the other shapes that already exist. It helps to build some depth into the painting. But this is where you can make this these kind of marks with a flat brush that are that narrow, but you can't get the nice bend and the radius into your brush stroke that you can with a liner brush. So that's why I've switched to this type of a brush to make these marks. And these have a little bit more purpose and are more intentional than some of the ones I did earlier with a flat brush, where I was just trying to make a pattern or a texture. These are more personal and intentional. You can just see I'm taking my time, and I'm trying to use these to create some direction and some overlap, and be smart about each brush mark to really make it count and make it add to the composition. Because when you're adding a series of brush strokes, if it's not going to improve your composition, you have to ask yourself, why are you putting them on there? Now I'm putting a few very subtle marks in there with this liner brush. They may be hard to pick up on the camera, but they're just kind of little wisps of a mark that might suggest like a thin branch, and they're kind of in one direction, kind of a curved direction, to try and give a little motion and almost feel like it could be windy. It's hard to see maybe on the camera a little bit, but I'll do this sometimes in my florals to try and create some motion. I'll create these kind of grassy wisps and that kind of jet out and curve around. And it's an attempt on my part to try and create a little bit of motion in my painting. Taking a dark value here, and I'm just reinforcing a little bit of the kind of a horizon line there to give me a stronger horizontal plane. You really need to have a nice horizontal plane when you're working with a landscape, and my shadows kind of do that, some of the shadows, but I want to try and create somewhat of a horizon back there. Here I've loaded a brush, a smaller brush with a little bit of that orange tone, and I'm just tapping it on my hand so I can get a little bit of splatter of that color in some different areas of my painting. Here I'm doing the same thing with a darker value. It helps give the repetition of that splatter. I have the orange, I have the dark value, and again, it just helps tie things together. As I wind this down, I'm taking a little bit of cerulean blue and putting it in a few areas just to move a little bit of this kind of a blue light throughout the composition. And in some of these areas of the tree, it makes it feel a little bit more like snow rather than just a highlighted area. So that blue tone kind of helps that along and makes it more believable as snow. So that's my painting, Snowy Redwood. It's my interpretation of the subject I was looking at in the reference photo. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you saw some things that you'd like to try in your painting process. If you ever have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page of my website. And if you have specific questions, you can contact me at rsurowitzart@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like it, share it, and comment. Thanks for watching.